She built a brick bed over her stove. Silas Fenwick, who had survived 9 Dakota winters and buried a wife to the cold, told her plainly, "A woman alone can't cut enough timber. Those children will freeze with you." She had $17, 2 children, and needed 6 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 86 degrees in 12 hours. But 5 months earlier, Maren Halvorsen had never laid a single brick in her life. The August sun pressed down on Emmons County, Dakota Territory, as Maren pulled her wagon to a stop beside the claim shanty. 16 by 12 feet of weathered boards, no foundation, gaps between the planks wide enough to slip a finger through. This was what her husband had left her when the fever took him in May. She climbed down from the wagon and walked the perimeter, counting problems. The children watched from the seat, Christian 7 and little Else 4, too tired from the journey to ask questions. Maren had sold their Minnesota farm for $43, paid $19 for the wagon, $7 for the mule. That left $17. The proving up deadline was 2 years away. If she abandoned the claim now, she lost the 160 acres her husband had worked 3 seasons to hold. The shanty door hung crooked on leather hinges. Inside, a rusted cook stove, a straw tick mattress gray with mildew, a wooden crate nailed to the wall as a shelf. Nothing else. Maren stood in the doorway and felt the wind push through the boards behind her. In winter, that wind would carry temperatures of 30 below zero, maybe 40 below. She had read the accounts in the Minnesota newspapers. Whole families found frozen in their beds, children dead beside cold stoves. She had $17, 2 children, and 5 months to prepare for a winter that killed grown men with experience. That first week, Maren walked her claim. 160 acres of rolling grass, treeless except for a thin line of cottonwoods along Beaver Creek, 3 miles east. 3 miles each way. 6 miles to haul every stick of firewood. Silas Fenwick rode over on the 4th day. He owned the section to the north, a soddy he had built himself in '79, a wife who had died 2 winters back, a reputation for plain talk that bordered on cruelty. He sat his horse and looked at her shanty without dismounting. "Board walls," he said, "might as well be paper." "I know," Maren said. Fenwick had survived 9 Dakota winters. He had buried his wife after the blizzard of '83, when she walked 50 yards to the well and never found her way back. They discovered her body in April, 20 feet from the door. "You know what a winter here does?" Fenwick asked. Maren waited. "A man with a full crew can cut and haul 8 cords before the freeze. You need 6 cords minimum to survive. That's running the stove low, bundling the children, sleeping cold. 8 to be safe." He studied her. "You have no crew. You have no horse team for heavy hauling. You have a mule and 2 children who can't swing an axe." "I can cut wood," Maren said. "One woman, working hard, can manage half a cord a day. Good days. And you'll lose days to rain, to the children sick, to everything else that goes wrong. Even if you worked every day from now until freeze up, you'd have maybe 50 days. 25 cords at best if nothing went wrong." He shook his head. "But things go wrong. They always go wrong." "Then what do you suggest?" Fenwick turned his horse. "Sell the claim. Go back where you came from. A woman alone can't cut enough timber, and those children will freeze with you if you try." He rode north without looking back. That night, Maren sat with her children in the shanty and did the arithmetic. 6 cords minimum, 8 cords to be safe. 50 working days, maybe. Half a cord per day if she pushed hard. That was 25 cords, but Fenwick was right. She would lose days. Many days. Realistically, she might manage 10 cords if everything went perfectly. 10 cords. She needed 8 to survive. But she needed those 8 cords cut, split, hauled 3 miles, and stacked before the first hard freeze in late October, and she needed to feed herself and the children while doing it, and repair the shanty, and buy supplies before the store closed accounts for winter. The arithmetic didn't work. She lay awake that night listening to the wind through the walls and thinking about her children's faces, blue and still in the cold. The Vogler family lived 2 miles southeast, on a quarter section they had claimed in '84. German Russians from the Black Sea, part of the wave that had poured into Dakota after the railroads advertised free land and religious freedom. Heinrich Vogler had died of blood poisoning the previous spring, leaving his widow Frida with 4 children and his mother, Oma Katrine, who was 73 and spoke no English. Maren met Frida at the Mercantile in Linton, 12 miles south, where both women had come to price flour. They recognized something in each other, the particular exhaustion of women farming alone, and walked out together. "Your husband?" Frida asked. "May, typhoid." Frida nodded. "Heinrich, April, a cut that went bad." They stood beside their wagons in the August heat, neither woman ready to make the long drive home. "How are you keeping the place?" Maren asked. "Oma Katrine knows things, old ways from Russia." Frida paused. "You should come, see the house, how they built it in the old country." Maren came on a Saturday, bringing Christian and Elsa. The Vogler house was sod, 3-foot walls of stacked prairie, a roof of poles, and more sod, a single room that felt cool despite the heat outside. But it was not the walls that caught Maren's attention. It was the stove. The cook stove sat in the corner as expected. But behind it, stretching along the entire south wall, rose a structure unlike anything Maren had seen. A platform of clay bricks, 3 feet wide, 18 inches high, covered with wool blankets and quilts. A sleeping surface built of stone. Oma Katrine sat on it now, her back against the sod wall, her knitting needles clicking. The old woman felt Maren's stare and said something in German. Frida translated. "She asks if you want to touch it." Maren placed her palm on the brick surface. Warm. Not hot. The stove fire had burned down hours ago, but distinctly, impossibly warm. "How?" Maren asked. Frida gestured for her to look behind the platform. There, where the stovepipe should have run straight up through the roof, it instead turned horizontal, disappeared into the brick structure, wound back and forth through channels Maren could not see, and finally emerged at the far end to rise through the ceiling. "The smoke goes through," Frida explained. "The bricks catch the heat. Hold it. Release it slowly." In Russia, Oma Katrine says, the old one slept on the stove itself, on the pechka. But here she wanted a bigger surface. For the children, Maren stared at the platform. The stove had not burned since morning, 8 hours at least, and the bricks were still warm enough to feel through her palm. "How long does it stay warm?" Frida asked Oma Katrine. The old woman held up fingers. 8. Then added more words. 8 hours easy, 12 if you fire it hot before bed. She says in the worst cold in Russia, when they couldn't get fuel, the bricks stayed warm 2 days. Not hot, but warm enough. 2 days. Maren thought about her board shanty with its gaps and cracks. She thought about the wind that would find every opening. She thought about the 6 cords she could not cut and the children she could not bear to lose. "Could I build one?" she asked. Clara Johansson found Maren hauling clay from the creek bed 3 days later. Clara was Norwegian, too, from the same region as Maren's late husband, a practical woman who had proven her own claim successfully and now helped her bachelor brother work his. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. Maren explained. The platform, the channels, the heat stored in brick and clay and released slowly through the night. Clara listened. She was not unkind, but she was careful, and she had survived by being careful. I don't understand, Clara said finally. You're spending your days hauling clay instead of cutting wood? The wood won't be enough. Even if I cut from now until freeze up, then cut faster. Clara, the arithmetic doesn't work. So you're building a bed out of bricks? Clara shook her head. How much wood does this save you? Marin had asked Oma Katrine the same question. If I heat the bricks fully before sleeping, I can bank the stove to almost nothing overnight. The platform holds the heat. 8 hours, maybe more. That's 8 hours I'm not burning through my wood pile. And how much wood does that save across a winter? Oma Katrine thinks maybe half. Half the fuel for the same warmth. Clara stared at the pile of clay in Marin's wagon. So instead of needing 6 cords, you need 3. 3 I might actually cut. And if this platform of yours doesn't work, if it cracks, or doesn't hold heat, or fills your shanty with smoke, then I burn what wood I have and pray. Clara looked at the sky, at the summer sun that seemed so permanent and was so brief. You're gambling your children's lives on something you saw once in a German widow's house, something you've never built, something no one here has tried. What choice do I have? Cut more wood. There isn't enough time. Clara mounted her horse. There's never enough time. That's the territory. You work until you can't, and then you pray, and either you survive or you don't. But you don't build castles out of mud and hope for miracles. She rode toward her brother's claim, and Marin went back to hauling clay. The following weeks blurred into exhaustion and mud. Marin worked before dawn and after dark. The children helped where they could, Christian mixing clay with straw, Elsa carrying bricks one at a time across the shanty floor. She paid Frida's oldest boy, Johann, with her last decent dress to haul fieldstone from the creek. $8 at the mercantile bought sacking for the clay forms and a second-hand trowel with a cracked handle. The platform rose along the north wall, opposite the stove. She dug the foundation 6 inches into the packed earth floor, laid fieldstone for drainage, built the channel walls with clay bricks she formed herself, 284 in all, each one shaped in a wooden form, dried in the sun, stacked by small hands. The channels wound back and forth like a snake. She copied the pattern she had seen in Oma Katrine's platform, though she could not know if she had remembered it correctly. The stovepipe entered at the west end, nearest the stove. It traveled east, turned, traveled west, turned again, repeated the pattern 4 times before exiting through the roof at the far end. Each turn meant more brick surface for the smoke to touch. Each brick surface meant more heat captured and stored. By mid-September, the platform was 3 feet wide and 18 inches high. She topped it with flat stones hauled from the creek, then sealed every gap with clay mortar mixed with horsehair she had begged from the Fenwick stable. The children watched her press the mortar into cracks, smoothing it with her raw-tipped fingers. "Does it work?" Christian asked. "We'll find out." She lit the stove that evening with the last of her summer kindling, cooked their dinner, let the fire burn hot for 3 hours after. At 10 o'clock, she banked the stove to coals and pressed her palm against the platform's surface. Warm, distinctly warm. She woke at 2 in the morning, the shanty cold, the stove barely smoldering, pressed her hand to the bricks, still warm. At 6, with the first gray light through the gaps in the boards, she checked again. The warmth had faded but not vanished. 6 hours since she had banked the fire. The bricks held heat like a memory. It was working. But September was not January. Tobias Grubb rode over on an afternoon when Marin was splitting cottonwood behind the shanty. He owned 4 sections to the south, ran cattle, had tried twice to buy her husband's claim before the fever, and twice more after. He did not dismount. He watched her swing the axe, watched the wood split clean, watched her stack the pieces on the pile that was too small, always too small. "Fenwick says you built something inside," Grubb said. "Some kind of German contraption." Marin buried the axe in the splitting stump. "What of it?" "Says you're heating bricks instead of cutting wood." "I'm doing both." Grubb smiled. His teeth were brown at the edges. "Counting that pile there, I make you have about 2 cords, maybe 2.5. We're 6 weeks from freeze-up." "I'm aware." "And you're spending your days playing with mud." Marin wiped the sweat from her forehead. The children were inside, and she was glad they were not here to see this. "I've made you a fair offer 3 times," Grubb continued. $40 for the claim and everything on it. That's more than it's worth, and we both know it." "No." "Pride won't keep your children alive when the temperature drops to 40 below. Pride won't hold heat when the wind blows through those board walls." He leaned forward in his saddle. "That German stove bed won't save you. It's a trick for fools, and you're a fool for building it. Get off my land." Grubb held up his hands in mock surrender. "I'll be back after the thaw, either to make another offer or to file on abandoned property." He turned his horse. "One of those children is going to die this winter, probably both, and when they do, remember I gave you a way out." He rode south, and Marin stood by her woodpile, her hands shaking with rage and fear. October brought the first frost, and a gift Marin had not expected. He was returning from the creek with a wagon of cottonwood when she saw the Norwegian man waiting by her shanty, old Henriksen, widower, alone on a claim 5 miles north. He stood beside a sledge piled with split logs. "I heard what you're building," he said without greeting. "The heated bed." Marin waited. "My wife wanted me to try something like it. Read about it in a Swedish magazine, years back. I told her it was foolishness." He paused. "She died in 81. Cold took her lungs." "I'm sorry. I brought you 2 cords of ash. Good wood. Burns hot." Marin stared at the sledge. 2 cords. That was a week of her labor, maybe more. "I can't pay you." "Don't want pay." Henriksen looked at her shanty, at the woodpile, at the children peeking from the doorway. "Want you to survive? Want to see if the contraption works?" He met her eyes. "And if it does, I want you to teach me how to build one." He unloaded the wood without asking for help, then climbed on his sledge and drove north. The children ran to the pile and touched the bark as if it were gold. 2 cords of ash. Added to what she had cut, that made 4 cords total. 4 cords was not enough, but 4 cords was closer. The platform was finished on October 23rd. She had sealed the last gaps, tested the draw, confirmed that smoke traveled the full length of the channels, and exited clean through the roof. The bricks warmed within an hour of a hot fire. They held heat 8 hours after the fire burned low. 10 hours if she banked it carefully. She made calculations in her head, over and over. 4 cords of good wood. At normal burning, that was 8 weeks. Not enough for a Dakota winter that could stretch 5 months. But with the platform, she didn't need normal burning. She could heat the bricks during the day, bank the stove almost to nothing at night, let the masonry carry them through. If the platform worked as she hoped, 4 cords might stretch to 12 weeks, maybe 14. That still left a gap. January through February at least. She would need to cut more. Every day until freeze up, every day the temperature allowed, she would be at the creek with the axe. But the platform was finished, and outside her shanty, the sky had turned the color of iron. On November 3rd, Silas Fenwick stopped by. He did not dismount. He looked at the fresh woodpile, larger now than when he had visited in August, and his face showed nothing. "I hear it's going to be a bad winter," he said. "The woolly caterpillars are darker than anyone's seen. Old Henriksen says the muskrats are building high." "I've heard. You've got maybe 4 cords there. That's not enough." "I know." Fenwick studied her. "That brick thing inside. Frida Vogler says you built it yourself." "With help from my children." "Does it work?" Maren hesitated. "It holds heat. Whether it holds enough heat, I won't know until January." Fenwick nodded slowly. "My wife used to talk about a Swedish stove she remembered from the old country. Big masonry thing. Held heat all night from one firing." He paused. "I told her it was too much work, that we had enough wood." "Did you?" "Always seemed like we did, until we didn't." He pulled his coat tighter. "The temperature's going to drop tonight. Hard freeze coming, maybe worse." He looked at her pile again. "If you need help, if it gets bad, light a fire outside the shanty. I'll see the smoke." He rode north. That night, the temperature fell below 0 for the first time. Maren fired the stove hot, watched the bricks absorb the heat through the evening, banked the coals at midnight. She woke at 4 to check the platform. The surface was warm. The children slept soundly beneath their quilts, unaware of the cold that pressed against the board walls. 3 cords remained in the pile. She could stretch them further now. But December was coming, and January after, and February after that, and the real test still lay ahead. On January the 7th, 1888, the temperature dropped to 14 below 0 and held there for 3 days. Maren burned through half a cord keeping the platform heated, but it worked. The bricks released warmth all night. The children slept warm. 2.5 cords left. 4 weeks of desperate cold still to come, maybe more. Then, on January 12th, she woke to air that felt wrong. Too warm. The thermometer by the door read 40 degrees above 0, spring-like, impossible, wrong. By 10 in the morning, the temperature had risen to 44 degrees. Farmers were working in shirt sleeves. Children were sent to school without coats. And to the northwest, where the sky should have been clear, a line of black cloud was building, a wall of black stretching from horizon to horizon. Maren stood in her doorway and watched it come. The wall of black moved faster than a horse at full gallop. Maren had perhaps 20 minutes. She ran to the woodpile and loaded her arms, 4 trips, 5, 6, stacking cottonwood and ash beside the stove until the pile blocked half the floor. Her boots punched through the crusted snow. Her breath came in gasps that hung white in the suddenly still air. The temperature had been 44 degrees at 10 that morning. Now, at 11:15, it had already dropped to 38. She could feel the cold coming before it arrived. A pressure change, a weight in the air, something ancient and predatory moving across the plains. She checked the water bucket. Full. Checked the flour bin. Half. Checked the dried beef hanging from the rafter. Enough for 3 days, maybe 4. Checked the children. Christian was playing with wooden blocks by the platform, building a tower that kept collapsing. Else was napping on the quilts, her small body curled against the warm bricks, her thumb in her mouth. Neither child understood what was coming. Neither child had seen a killing storm. Maren had. Once, in Minnesota, the winter of '83. She had watched through a farmhouse window as the white wall descended, and she had listened to the screaming of cattle that could not find the barn. 37 animals dead by morning. 2 neighbors frozen in their own dooryard. This storm looked worse. "Christian," Maren said, keeping her voice steady. "Help me seal the door." The boy looked up from his blocks. He was 7, old enough to hear the change in his mother's voice, young enough to trust that she could fix whatever was wrong. He stood without asking questions. They stuffed rags into the gaps around the door frame, every scrap of cloth Maren could spare, packed tight until no light showed through. They hung a quilt over the single window, nailing it at the corners with tacks she had saved from a feed sack. They pushed the straw tick mattress against the worst crack in the south wall, where the boards had warped and pulled apart over 3 seasons of Dakota weather. The wind was already rising. She could hear it building to the northwest, a sound like a distant train, like 1,000 voices humming the same low note, growing louder each minute. The black wall had swallowed the horizon. It was swallowing the sky. At 11:30, the temperature stood at 42 degrees. By 11:45, it had dropped to 31. At noon, the wall hit. Visibility vanished in an instant, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the world. The black cloud was not black at all, Maren realized. It was white. Snow so thick and so fine that it blocked the sun completely. The darkness was the darkness of being buried alive. Snow came horizontal, not falling but driven, moving parallel to the ground at 60 miles per hour. It penetrated every crack Maren had failed to seal. It found the gaps around the stovepipe, the loose board by the window, the space beneath the door, where the rags did not quite reach. Within minutes, a fine white powder had accumulated on the floor. Within an hour, small drifts were forming in the corners of the shanty. The temperature plummeted. 30 degrees, 20, 10, 0. Maren watched the thermometer by the door as if watching a clock count down to execution. The mercury fell so fast she could see it moving, a silver thread retreating into the bulb, marking degrees and minutes instead of hours. The wind screamed, not gusted, screamed, a continuous howl that seemed to press against the walls, to search for weaknesses, to want inside. The board walls flexed, the roof groaned. Somewhere in the white chaos, something wooden cracked and fell, a fence post perhaps, or a branch from the cottonwoods 3 miles away. Maren could not see. She could not know. She could only hear the wind and feel the cold and watch her children's faces in the flickering light of the stove. By 1 o'clock, the thermometer by the door read 12 below 0. The gaps in the board walls were whistling, high, thin sounds, almost musical, that might have been beautiful if they had not meant death. Snow dust accumulated on the floor despite the rags and quilts. The corners of the shanty were already white. Maren loaded the stove until the iron glowed orange. She fed it again an hour later, and again an hour after that. The platform absorbed the heat. She could feel it warming beneath her palm, the bricks drinking in energy like a sponge drinks water, but the cold kept coming, kept pressing, kept finding its way inside. At 4 o'clock, the temperature fell past 30 below 0 and kept falling. Else woke crying. The child's lips were blue-tinged despite the quilts, despite the heated bricks beneath her. Maren pulled both children onto the platform, wrapped them together in every blanket she owned, the wool quilt from Minnesota, the buffalo robe she had traded for in September, the cotton sheets that were almost useless but added one more layer, and lay her body over theirs. The children were warm now. She could feel their small hearts beating against her chest, but the stove consumed wood at a rate she had never seen. 2 hours of burning for every hour of warmth. The pile beside the stove shrank visibly, log by log, and she had no way to replenish it without opening the door. She would not open that door, not while the wind screamed, not while the white death swirled 10 feet away. By nightfall, she had burned through half a cord. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 below 0. Inside the shanty, ice was forming on the water bucket, a thin skin at first, then thicker, spreading inward from the edges like frost on a window. The platform held. The bricks radiated heat upward through the quilts. The children slept. Maren did not sleep. Through the night, Maren fed the fire and watched her children breathe. She slept in snatches, 20 minutes, 30, jerking awake each time to check the stove, to touch the platform, to confirm that warmth still existed somewhere in this frozen world. The wind never stopped. The cold never relented. The shanty walls popped and cracked as moisture in the wood froze and expanded. Snow continued to sift through gaps she had not known existed, building miniature drifts against the east wall, the north wall, creeping toward the platform like white fingers. At 3 a.m, she loaded the last of the wood she had brought inside. 12 logs. 4 hours of burning, maybe 5 if she damped the stove hard. After that, she would need to open the door. She tried at 3:30. The door would not move. Snow had drifted against it, packed by wind, compressed by hours of accumulation, frozen solid by temperatures that had bottomed out at 47 below zero. A wall of ice sealed them inside, 3 feet deep and hard as concrete. Maren threw her shoulder against the boards. Nothing. She tried again, bracing her feet, throwing her weight. The wood groaned but held. She found the axe, the same axe she had used to split cottonwood all autumn, and swung it at the gap between door and frame. Ice chips flew. The gap widened by half an inch. She swung again. The handle was slippery with frost. Her hands ached. The cold poured through the widening crack like water through a broken dam. She stopped. She could not clear the drift without letting the cold inside. She could not let the cold inside without endangering the children. She was trapped. The woodpile was 10 feet away, and she could not reach it. The stove had enough fuel for perhaps 2 more hours. After that, the fire would die. After that, the platform would begin releasing its stored heat, the heat she had been building through days of careful firing, the heat that represented her entire gamble, her only answer to the arithmetic that had never added up. After that, she would learn whether the bricks could hold enough warmth to keep her children alive. At 5 a.m, the last log burned down to coals. Maren banked them carefully, spreading the embers across the firebox floor, closing the damper to the smallest opening that would still allow draft, slowing the burn to almost nothing. The stove would hold heat for another hour, maybe 2. The smoke would continue to travel through the platform channels, warming the bricks a little longer. Every minute of residual burning was heat stored. Every degree stored was time. She pressed her palm to the platform surface. Warm. Definitely warm. Perhaps 90 degrees, perhaps more. The bricks had absorbed heat for 3 days before the storm, and through 15 hours of continuous firing during. They held perhaps 1,000 pounds of clay and stone, dense and patient, releasing what they had stored grain by grain. The question was whether they had stored enough. She gathered the children close. Elsa's breathing was shallow but steady. Christian's face was pale beneath his winter tan, his lips slightly parted, his hands curled into fists even in sleep. Maren pulled the quilts over all 3 of them, pressed her body against the warm bricks, and waited. Outside, the wind screamed on. 6 o'clock came. The stove held coals, but no flame. The platform was still warm. Maren checked by pressing her palm flat against the brick surface, holding it there for 10 seconds, feeling the heat radiate upward through her skin. Still perhaps 80 degrees. Still warm enough to matter. 7 o'clock. The coals had gone gray, not black, not cold, but that ashy gray that meant the fire was truly dying. Maren's breath fogged in the air above the quilts. The shanty's interior had dropped to perhaps 30 degrees, perhaps 25, cold enough to see your breath, not yet cold enough to kill, but beneath the blankets, against the bricks, she could still feel heat rising. 8 o'clock, 9. The wind continued to howl. The temperature outside had fallen past 45 below zero. She learned this later from the records kept in Bismarck, from the Weather Service reports that would document the storm as one of the worst in territorial history. Inside the shanty, ice crept across the floor. Frost climbed the walls in feathered patterns, beautiful and deadly. The water bucket froze solid, the ice splitting the wooden staves, water expanding as it crystallized. But the platform held. At 10 o'clock, Marin pressed her palm to the brick surface for the 100th time. Cooler now, definitely cooler, perhaps 70 degrees, perhaps 65, but still warm enough to feel through her skin. The children slept beneath the quilts, their small bodies contributing their own heat to the pocket of warmth above the bricks. 300 BTUs from each child, the same heat they would have radiated regardless, now trapped and conserved in the space between quilts and masonry. The door remained frozen shut. She had no wood, no fire, no way to generate new heat. Everything depended on what the platform had stored. 11 o'clock. 12. The bricks continued to release their warmth, slow and steady, like blood from a body. The surface temperature had dropped to perhaps 50 degrees, cool to the touch now, barely warm, but still warmer than the air, still warmer than the quilts alone would have been. The children stirred in their sleep, but did not wake. Their color remained good. Their breathing remained steady. Outside, somewhere in the white chaos, Marin heard screaming. It was not wind. It was human, a voice, high and desperate, rising and falling and then cutting off. A child's voice, perhaps, or a woman's. The sound came from the southeast, then the northwest, then nowhere at all. The storm played tricks with sound, carrying voices miles from their source, swallowing screams that came from 10 feet away. Marin pressed her ear to the wall, trying to locate the sound. Nothing. The wind howled on, monotonous and vast, admitting no human interruption. She could do nothing. She could not open her door. She could not help whoever was dying in the cold. She could only lie on her platform, hold her children, and listen to the screaming fade into the white. She pulled the quilts tighter and waited. At 2 in the afternoon on January 13th, the wind began to die. Not all at once it withdrew in stages, the screaming dropping to a roar, the roar to a moan, the moan to something almost like silence. The snow stopped driving horizontal. The pressure on the walls eased. Through the cracks and gaps, gray light began to filter, the first natural light Marin had seen in 26 hours. The sky was lightening. The storm was passing. Marin forced herself up from the platform. Her joints ached from cold and stillness. Her knees cracked. Her back protested. Her fingers felt swollen and clumsy. She stumbled to the door and threw her shoulder against it, once, twice, 3 times. The ice cracked. The drift shifted. On the 4th try, the door swung open 6 inches. Arctic air hit her face like a slap. The temperature was still 30 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill a person who stayed outside too long. But the wind had stopped, and in the strange calm that followed the storm, she could see. Her woodpile was half buried in a drift, but still there, a mound of white with dark edges showing through. The chicken coop had collapsed. She would mourn those hens later, mourn the eggs she would not have in spring. The mule's shelter still stood barely, one wall leaning at an angle that would need repair. She squeezed through the gap in the doorway, the ice scraping her shoulders, and retrieved an armful of frozen logs. The wood was so cold it burned her hands through her gloves. She carried it inside, then another armful, then a third. Her fingers grew numb. Her cheeks stung with early frostbite. She rebuilt the fire with those numb fingers, coaxing flame from coals that had somehow, impossibly, stayed alive. Tiny orange points in a sea of gray ash, enough to catch kindling, enough to restart what had nearly died. The stove roared back to life. The platform began absorbing heat again. The children woke to warmth. "Mama?" Christian said, his voice thick with sleep. "Is it over?" "Not yet." Marin touched his forehead, cool but not cold, alive, breathing, surviving. "But we're still here." She checked Elsa. The little girl's color had returned, pink cheeks, pink lips, the healthy flush of a child who had slept well and warm. She smiled up at Marin from beneath the quilts, a smile that held no knowledge of how close she had come, no understanding of the hours her mother had spent watching her breathe. "I'm hungry," Elsa said. Marin laughed. It came out as a sob. 27 hours. The fire had died at 5 a.m. on January 12th. The platform had held detectable warmth until past 8 that evening, 15 hours without flame. It had retained enough residual warmth through the night to keep the space beneath the quilts above freezing. And now the fire burned again, and the bricks were warming again, and they were alive. But through the gaps in the door, Marin could see the sky to the northwest. The gray was darkening. The clouds were building. The storm was not finished. The second wave hit at 4 that afternoon. Marin had hoped for more time. Hours to dig out the woodpile, hours to check on neighbors, hours to simply breathe. The storm gave her 2 hours. Then the wind returned with renewed fury, 60 miles per hour, the Weather Service later estimated possibly more. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature, which had risen briefly to 15 below during the lull, plunged back past 30. But Marin was ready this time. She had stacked 3 days of wood inside before the wind returned. Every log she could reach, every stick she could carry, piled beside the stove until the children had to climb over it to reach the platform. She had filled every container with snow to melt for water, buckets, pots, jars, the children's tin cups. She had checked her flour, her dried meat, her precious jar of molasses that she had been saving for Christmas pancakes they had never made. They could last a week inside, if necessary. They would last. The platform had proven itself. Now it had to prove itself again. She fired the stove hot through the afternoon, building the platform's heat reserve. The bricks absorbed energy for hours. She could feel them warming deep, not just on the surface, but throughout their mass, the heat penetrating inch by inch into clay that had cooled overnight. By nightfall, the platform radiated steady warmth even with the stove banked low. They slept that night bundled together on the bricks, the 3 of them forming a pocket of warmth while the wind raged and the temperature dropped past 40 below zero. Marin woke twice to feed the stove, not desperately, not in the cold sweat of fear, but steadily, calmly, maintaining the heat she had built. The platform worked. She knew it now with certainty that went beyond hope. Whatever happened, whatever the storm still held, the platform worked. The storm broke on January 14th, 49 hours after it began. Marin woke to silence, true silence, not the suppressed roar of wind beyond the walls, not the whistling of gaps and cracks, but the absolute stillness that follows catastrophe. No wind, no creaking, no driven snow hissing against the boards. Just silence, vast and ringing, as if the world itself had stopped to catch its breath. She crept from the quilts, careful not to wake the children, crossed to the door on bare feet that flinched from the frozen floor, pushed against the boards. The door swung open. The world had been remade in white. Drifts reached the roofline in some places, great sculpted waves of snow that had been shaped by wind and frozen in place. The woodpile was a smooth mound with no edges, a white hill where her careful stacks had been. The horizon stretched flat and empty and glittering beneath a sky so blue it seemed impossible, so blue it hurt to look at after 49 hours of gray and black and nothing. The temperature stood at 38 below zero. Maren stepped outside in her boots and coat, her breath fogging in thick white clouds, her eyes watering in the brilliant cold. The snow squeaked beneath her feet, that particular sound of deep cold, of temperatures far below zero, of moisture frozen so hard it compressed like sand. She walked 20 yards from the shanty. Her legs sank to the knee in some drifts, found hardpack in others. The world was silent except for the squeak of snow and the rasp of her breathing. That was when she saw the first body. It was a child, a boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing nothing but a cloth coat and summer boots. He lay on his side in the snow, his arms crossed over his chest as if he had been cold, his face peaceful. Frost had formed on his eyebrows, his lashes, the fine hair at his temples. He might have been sleeping. She did not recognize him. She did not know where he had come from. She stood looking at him for a long moment, at his small frozen hands, at his closed eyes, at the peace that had found him at the end. Then she marked the spot with a stick from the fence line and walked on. She found 3 more bodies that day. The Schuler boy, 14, who had been walking home from the schoolhouse 2 miles east. He lay face down in a drift 50 yards from his family's barn, so close he might have seen it if the storm had lifted for even a moment. His father found him the same morning Maren did. His mother's screaming carried across the snow for half a mile. Mrs. Erickson, 63, who had gone to check on her chickens and lost her way in the white. She was found by her husband 12 feet from their back door, frozen standing up against the henhouse wall, her hands still stretched toward the latch she had been trying to find. A man Maren did not know, frozen in a seated position against a fence post, his hands bare, his lips drawn back from his teeth in a final grimace. He had a letter in his pocket addressed to someone in Minnesota. He had been riding the train when the storm hit, had gotten off at the wrong station, had tried to walk to shelter that did not exist. The storm had killed. It had killed across 300 miles of Dakota and Nebraska and Minnesota, from Bismarck to Omaha, from the Missouri River to the Minnesota lakes. 235 people, the newspapers would later report, 213 of them children, caught at school, caught walking home, caught in a world that had turned white and deadly in less than an hour. The schoolhouse blizzard, they would call it, the children's blizzard, the storm that came on a warm January morning and left small bodies scattered across the frozen prairie like discarded toys. But Maren's children were alive. Silas Fenwick rode to her shanty on January 16th, 2 days after the storm broke. He came alone, on the same horse he had ridden in August when he told her she would freeze. The snow had drifted high enough that the horse had to lunge through some sections, breaking trail through white walls that reached its chest. Fenwick sat rigid in the saddle, his face red with cold, his eyes scanning the transformed landscape as if seeing it for the first time. He did not dismount. He looked at the smoke rising from her stovepipe, thin and steady, the smoke of a well-managed fire. He looked at the children playing in the cleared space by the door, where Maren had shoveled a path and packed the snow into walls they could climb. He looked at the woman who stood watching him, with exhaustion in every line of her body, exhaustion and something else, something that might have been pride. "You made it," he said. "Yes. I saw smoke on the 12th, thought about riding over." He paused, his breath fogged in the cold air. Couldn't see 10 feet in front of my horse. Couldn't see my own hand. I know. Fenwick shifted in his saddle. His face was working through something, pride, perhaps, or the difficulty of what he was about to say, or the memory of another storm, another woman, another shanty, where the smoke had stopped rising and never started again. That brick thing, he said finally. The platform. Frida Vogler says it stores heat. It does. How long? Maren thought about the 15 hours without flame, the warmth that had held through the worst of the night, the children who had slept while the temperature dropped past 40 below, while the wind screamed, while somewhere outside a voice had risen and fallen and finally stopped. Long enough, she said. Fenwick nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet Maren could see the years on his face. 9 Dakota winters, a wife buried in the spring thaw, nights alone in a soddy, wondering if he could have done something different, built something different, saved her somehow. My wife wanted me to build something like that, he said at last. Swedish stove, she called it. Saw it in a magazine from the old country. Big masonry thing that held heat all night from one firing. He paused. I told her it was too much work, that we had enough wood, that it was foolishness. Did you have enough wood? Always seemed like we did, until we didn't. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold that was still 30 below zero, still killing cold, still the kind of cold that would freeze a man who stayed out too long. She went to the well on the second day of the blizzard, 50 yards, maybe less. She never came back. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Fenwick straightened in his saddle. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she had not seen before, not pride, not cruelty, not the dismissive certainty of a man who knew better. She saw recognition. She saw respect. Teach me how to build one, he said. Setau. Clara Johansson came the following week, on January 23rd. She brought flour and a ham and an expression Maren had never seen on her face, something between shame and wonder, something that looked like it hurt to wear. She stood in the doorway of the shanty for a long moment before speaking, her eyes moving from the stove to the platform to the children who sat on its warm surface playing with wooden blocks. The Schuler boy, Clara said finally. He was walking past your claim when the storm hit. Did you know? Maren thought of the child in the cloth coat, frozen 20 yards from her door. She had learned his name since then. Wilhelm. He had been 10 years old. He had been in the 4th grade at the schoolhouse 2 miles east, and he had left when the teacher dismissed early, and he had tried to walk home through a storm that was already killing. I saw him, Maren said, after. He was trying to reach your shanty. His father said so. The boy had heard about your brick platform. Everyone had heard by then. The German widow Vogler telling anyone who would listen. He thought if he could reach your place, he'd be safe. He didn't make it. No. Clara set down the flour, the ham. She stood with her empty hands, and Maren could see them trembling. But he was right. If he had reached your door, he would have lived. Wouldn't he? Maren did not answer. She did not need to. Clara walked to the platform and stood looking at it, at the bricks Maren had hauled from the creek in a dress she had traded for labor, at the channels she had shaped with her own raw-tipped fingers, at the stones she had sealed with mortar mixed with horsehair begged from Fenwick's stable. I called it foolishness, Clara said. I told you not to build it. I told you to cut more wood. You did. I was wrong. The words seemed to cost her something. Clara, who had never been wrong. Clara, who had survived by being careful. Clara, who had told Marin that the territory didn't allow for castles built of mud. I was wrong, and you were right, and your children are alive because you didn't listen to me. She touched the platform's surface with her fingertips. The bricks were warm. Marin had fired the stove that morning, and the heat had been building for hours, sinking deep into clay and stone. Will you teach me? Clara asked. Before next winter? Yes, Marin said. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Tobias Grubb did not come to Marin's shanty after the storm. He sold his claim in March, all 4 sections, the cattle gone, his hired men scattered to Minnesota and beyond. The blizzard had killed most of his stock. 300 head frozen in the fields, found only when the snow melted and revealed dark mounds that had once been animals. He lacked the resources to rebuild. He lacked perhaps the will. A Minnesota syndicate bought the land for 20 cents an acre, less than half what Grubb had paid for it 5 years before, less than a quarter of what he had offered Marin for her claim in October. He rode past her place on his way south, leading a pack horse loaded with what remained of his belongings. He did not stop. He did not speak. But she saw him look at the shanty, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the children playing in the spring mud that was just beginning to show through the melting snow. His eyes held something she had never seen there before. Not anger, not contempt, not the predatory certainty of a man who knew she would fail and was waiting to profit from it. Something worse. Recognition. Understanding. The knowledge that she had built something real, something that worked, something that had saved lives while his cattle froze and his fortune melted away. He did not look back as he rode south. Marin watched him go and felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, not even relief, only exhaustion and the quiet certainty that she would never see him again. By summer, 7 families in Emmons County had built heated platforms in their homes. Marin traveled to each one, the Henriksen claim 5 miles north, the Olson place by the creek, the Schumann homestead, where a German-Russian grandfather remembered platforms from the old country and wept when he saw what Marin had built. She showed them the channel patterns, explaining how the smoke must wind back and forth to transfer its heat. She demonstrated the proportions of clay to straw, 3 parts clay, 1 part straw, mixed with water until it held its shape but did not crack. She explained how to connect the stovepipe to the masonry inlet, how to maintain the slope that kept smoke moving, how to build the chimney at the far end to draw properly. She took no payment. She answered every question. She stayed until each platform was finished, until the first test firing showed smoke moving clean through the channels, until she could press her palm to the bricks and feel the warmth rising. Why? Frida Vogler asked her once, on a warm June evening, when the horror of January seemed impossible, when the children played barefoot in grass that would be snow again in 5 months. You could sell this. You could charge for teaching. You could make something for yourself. Marin thought about the boy in the cloth coat. Wilhelm Schuler, 10 years old, 20 yards from her door. She thought about the screaming she had heard through the wall on that first terrible night, the voice rising and falling and cutting off, the sound of someone dying in the cold while she lay helpless on her platform, unable to open her door, unable to help. She thought about Mrs. Erickson, frozen 12 feet from her back door, about the man from Minnesota, frozen against a fence post with a letter in his pocket, about the 235 people who had died across the northern plains, most of them children, most of them frozen within sight of shelter they could not reach. Because no one else should die for not knowing, she said. Oma Katrine, who understood no English but understood everything, nodded from her place on the platform. The old woman's hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were fixed on something far away. Russia, perhaps, or the old country, or all the winters she had survived with this ancient knowledge that Marin had learned in an afternoon and built with her own hands. The old ways, the new ways. They were the same in the end. They were survival. Marin Halvorsen proved up her claim in 1891, 3 years after the storm. She filed the final papers in Linton, signed her name in the county recorder's office, and walked out into spring sunshine, owning 160 acres free and clear. The land her husband had started and she had held. The land that was hers now, signed and sealed, earned with 5 years of labor and one January night when the bricks had held their heat and the children had lived. She never remarried. She raised Christian and Elsa alone on that land, farming wheat and keeping chickens and teaching her neighbors the old ways that had become new again in Dakota. The children grew tall and strong. Christian took over the farming at 16 when his hands were big enough for the plow. Elsa kept the house, kept the records, kept track of the debts they paid down year by year until they owed nothing and owned everything. Marin died in 1917, age 63, of pneumonia, the same disease that had taken so many on the frontier, the disease that came with cold and went with warmth. She was buried beside her husband in the Norwegian cemetery outside Linton, in a plot she had tended for 30 years. The headstone reads only her name and dates, nothing about the platform, nothing about the blizzard, nothing about the children she had saved. But the platform stood in her soddy until the building collapsed in 1934, 17 years after her death. The walls fell inward, the roof came down, the grass grew over the ruins. Only the platform remained, a mound of brick and stone in the middle of a collapsed room, too heavy to move, too solid to decay. By then, 300 families across Dakota and Nebraska had built variations of the same design. German Russians who remembered the Pechka, Norwegians who had heard of the Swedish stove, widows and widowers and farmers who had survived the blizzard of '88 and sworn they would never be caught without heat again. 300 platforms, 300 families, 300 chances that would not be wasted if the snow came again. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 86 degrees in 12 hours. The wind reached 60 miles per hour. The snow drove horizontal, fine as flour, blinding anyone caught outside. 235 people died across the northern plains, most of them frozen within sight of shelter they could not reach. Silas Fenwick, who had survived 9 Dakota winters and buried a wife in the blizzard of '83, had told Marin that a woman alone could not cut enough timber, that her children would freeze with her. On the morning of January 14th, when the storm finally broke, Marin Halvorsen walked out of her shanty into 38 degrees below zero. She had burned through most of her woodpile. She had spent 15 hours without flame. She had held her children against bricks that released warmth like a promise, hour by hour, degree by degree, until the cold had done its worst and passed on. And she had kept them alive. The platform stood where she had built it, clay bricks and field stone and straw, warm to the touch, patient as the earth it came from. The channels wound through its heart, empty now of smoke, but full of the heat that smoke had left behind. 1,000 pounds of masonry, 5 months of labor. One woman's answer to arithmetic that did not add up. Christian and Elsa played in the snow outside, their breath fogging, their cheeks red, their bodies whole and living. They threw snowballs at each other, laughing. They did not know how close they had come. They did not need to know. A brick bed built over a stove. A woman who had never laid brick in her life. 5 months. That was all she'd had. It was enough.